Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for coming out on a Friday evening and for sitting through this before the beer is served in the closeted room next door. I have the advantage of hearing four illustrious colleagues talk about area studies, and what strikes me is if 10 years ago we had had this conversation, we could not possibly have had a discussion on this topic without speaking deeply about the Cold War framework of area studies. We're not doing it. Hallelujah. That does not mean, however, that some of the consequences of the way knowledge was produced during those years are not still with us. And I think Professor Sakai was speaking very much to that issue. And what I hope to do in a couple of brief points is to speak a little bit about those conditions that we currently face that have perhaps shifted, but are, again, the conditions for the production of knowledge about Asia today. I'm not always so positive about this, and in fact what I think I want to do today is talk about two worries that I have. For if we're no longer talking about the Cold War, we can, as they say, the king is dead, long live the king, and there are all sorts of kings that we have to contend with today. One of them is most obvious when we look through the agenda or the calendar that we've been given for this conference, where I don't think in all the years that I've been coming to this conference I've quite seen as many stamps of institutions sponsored by different states from around the world. In fact, even our conference there, or our poster there, has the name of one of them. And I think this is something that we need to think a little bit about. Last night I was at another reception where an official from one of these foundations referred to all of us in the room as the assets, the allies, and the weapons for the Korean government's struggle to establish itself on the global stage. This is, of course, coming at the very same time that we're facing a funding crisis in North American universities. And it's very much the simultaneity of these two coming together that we are in what I could only describe as a type of delicate dance. For as much as we want to talk about the transnational histories, the potential of different types of Asian studies, we have to contend with institutions that are funding us, that have very status goals, that are deeply involved in the types of triumphalist narratives that we may want to question, and of course are deeply, deeply committed to the types of capitalist conditions that Lisa was speaking about. That's one worry, and of course, who would have imagined that there would be a rush by so many governments under this rather weak theorization of soft power to enter the university space and to participate in this knowledge production of Asia. So it's not just a question of those of us in North American institutions moving outwards in all sorts of ways. It's wondering about how other actors are going to be entering our institutions and sometimes helping them, of course, but also inhibiting the types of critical scholarship we can develop on Asia. The second worry I have, maybe because it's Friday night I'm speaking about worries too much, I'm fully in agreement with Prasenjit and talk about the need for transnational history. I think, again, if I were to use this, you can look through the types of talks that are being given at this conference, and it's all over the place. We can see even that I noticed in one of the advertisements from one of the publishers that there's a Palgrave Encyclopedia of Transnational History coming out, right? Once you begin to have encyclopedias like that, it's not necessarily cutting edge. But what I would like to do is go back to what Tanya Lee was speaking about and ask what is critical about this type of scholarship, and ask whether it is in fact critical. And we have to ask ourselves whether the analysis of the objective situation of a globalized or transnational world can or does necessarily lead to a critical form of scholarship. And here I mean perhaps not defined vis-a-vis policy, but in terms of trying to develop an analysis of a transnational, globalized Asia that does not build in the type of analytical frameworks that are used across the street in the business schools and in the schools of global governance. And I think we've all been at talks about transnational history, where if you change a few of the adjectives, you maybe get rid of the cynical tone, maybe push aside some of the moral righteousness about it, the logic contained in that talk is often not very much different from the types of textbooks that are being used in business schools. That, to me, is not a critical scholarship, and we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to use the possibilities of this moment, right? If we're switching into a new moment of possibility, how are we going to use this moment to try and create a type of transnational scholarship that does not legitimize or does not naturalize this version of a global or world history, as so often happens, but offers us a more insightful intervention into that history. 2 worries for a Friday night, and I hope that you can come and have a beer with me and tell me how to solve those worries.
Have a beer.
Professor Mrinalini Sinha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for waiting patiently till the end. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed and learned so much from our fellow panelists already. It's always hard to be the last act, especially because I feel a lot of what I want to say has been touched on by the various panelists already. I want to begin by doing what Andre just said none of us did, and that is to return us to the Cold War framework a little. That's right, I'm glad you were before me. My intellectual formation was in a disciplinary home in history, and in an institutional setting in a place like the US at a time, late 1980s and early 90s, when the area of the world that I wanted to study, South Asia, really belonged within a multidisciplinary, or was historically the domain of a multidisciplinary assemblage of scholars assembled together in this field called area studies. And I know that particular trajectory of history or of knowledge about South Asia is not the case in a place like Canada. But I hope some of the comments that I make will still resonate with some things that may be more familiar in this context and may perhaps more broadly. The first thing that I want to say is that Asian studies, the way I see it, coming out of that particular intellectual formation, is actually a very new thing. I know we've had an association that has given it an institutional home, Association of Asian Studies, but the reason I want to talk about it as a new thing is that I don't think Asian studies is simply the study of South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, and West Asia or the Middle East. And I'm not entirely sure the way people talk about Asian studies, it is the study of the interaction of these various parts. So what is Asian studies, and what is this talk about Asian studies? I think Asian studies comes out of 2 sort of different trajectories. And again, this is talking about it from my particular location. It comes out of a dissatisfaction with the area studies geopolitical segmentation of the globe as a result both of a sort of challenge to US geopolitical economic hegemony as a result of transnational integration of networks of finance, production and trade, where all of a sudden those earlier geopolitical area studies, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, just seemed irrelevant. And I think it's not surprising in that context that the real impetus for rethinking area studies comes from the US Department of Education and the US Department of Defense. So that's one kind of move towards, thinking beyond area studies. The other trajectory for it, of course, is much longer, and it comes from the desire of thinking about South-South connections, of thinking about these area studies interacting and perhaps imagining a different kind of a segmentation of the world. So if you think of Asian studies then as this new intellectual formation emerging out of these 2 trajectories, what is its value and how to think of it? I find particularly useful here insightful observation by Gail Hirschata, the president of the AAS this year, when she was talking about another field, and she says that we should think or imagine this field not as a space with determinate boundaries that calcify over time, but imagine it more as a conjuncture. And here, of course, she's borrowing from Gramsci and his reading through Stuart Hall and a number of others. And I just want to quote the definition of conjuncture from Gramsci here. He says, the conjuncture refers to the set of circumstances which determine the market in a given phase, provided these are conceived of as being in movement, that is, constituting a process of ever-changing combinations. The difference between situation and conjuncture is that the conjuncture is a set of immediate and ephemeral characteristics of the economic situation. And Hirschata goes on to say that she kind of wants to think of conjuncture, a field as a conjuncture rather than as a space, because she also wants to use it to loosen its connection with the market, but not completely sever the connection. And I think that's a very useful way of thinking about Asian studies as something, the conjunctural model enables us to think of it not as a space, but as something in flux, as something that's multi-determined, that makes us think of this Asian studies as having entanglements in various kinds of politics and processes. And I find that a useful way of thinking, partly because some of the alternatives that have been offered to area studies, I think, are a little problematic, and I'll go on to say why. I definitely agree that if we move away from a spatial model to this kind of temporal, conjunctural model that I'm talking about, I think there are ways in which some of the other alternatives, for example, the diasporic model, the network model, the oceanic model, the global transnational model as alternatives to area studies, I think lose some of the contributions that the area studies approach also made. I think it often entails throwing the baby, which is intense regional and language training in a particular area, for the bathwater, which is the civilizational as well as the particular geopolitical model that underpinned both the institutional formation of area studies as well as its substantive context. And I think given that, a number of scholars are thinking about, is there a way to bring back some of that area studies model? So for example, in the field of South Asian area studies, Sagatha Bose talks about the idea of South Asia without borders, to sort of both entail or retain some of the arguments, some of the advantages of area studies while as well as opening it. I think there's a problem with thinking about South Asia without borders, because once you remove the geographical, spatial, however arbitrary that was, and still insist on naming something South Asian, you end up, I think, with a sort of argument about cultural perdurance no matter where it goes. So South Asianness exists in various places without borders. So what is the alternative? And I think Asian studies, thought of conjuncturally, offers a very interesting alternative. And I want to give two examples of how it both works with some of the advantages or some of the strengths of an area studies model, but as well as works against it. One of the strengths of the area studies model was, of course, the kind of micro-level analyses, the increased pool of, really strong empirical information that we had got on peoples of Africa, America, Middle East, Latin America, Pacific. But the problem with it was that this particular knowledge of the distinctive historical experiences and contemporary realities of the peoples in those places was never fully assimilated into our theoretical categories, so which remained completely mired within narrow Euro-American and European and North American references. Now, if that was the condition, then transnationalizing, globalizing doesn't really help us very much, because our categories still remain mired in those European and North American references. And here I think an area studies model thought about conjuncturally can be particularly useful. And I'm going to give you two particular examples where I think how that kind of empirical knowledge that forces us to rethink our categories can be incredibly useful. And I give that name Asian studies. And I'm thinking here of the work of South Asianist Sheldon Pollock, who kind of does this wonderful history of the kind of divergent instantiations of the empire form in antiquity. And empires, he argues, have involved historical imitations, and they still work through historical imitations. And he talks about the Achaemenid Empire of between 550 to 330 BCE, and which was often considered like the first world political empire. And he argues that this empire produced a model for the emergence of successor empires, say, for example, in Rome and in early South Asia. But both of these models varied considerably, especially in the way in which they constituted the relationship between culture and power. And he argues that the early Indian polity, this early Indian model of empire, was expansive culturally, but unlike Rome, it did not subscribe to an ideology of limitless territorial expansion. Now I want to ask, what are the implications then of thinking of this idea of these two models of empire when so much of our conceptual understanding of what an empire is based on the Roman model? What would it mean for us to rethink the idea of empire if we really took seriously the Indian model that he's talking about? And I think that's an especially relevant point when we think about the ways in which so many of the so-called non-European empires were both discovered, named, and identified as such during the period of European colonial empires, which themselves were modeled very much on that Roman model. So consider, for example, in the case of India, what would the Vijayanagar Empire, which lasted from about the 14th to the 17th century, what would that look like if we really opened up our categories of empire itself? That's one example. I think the similar work is being done, say, by South Asian feminist historians when they're rethinking the category of gender. So we don't think of gender as just something that is already determined by modern European history and then exported elsewhere to see how it works in these different contexts. What would it mean to rethink gender from its very, very different kinds of alignments in these other places? And I think this is where area studies, that kind of knowledge that it does, but not thought of spatially, but thought of in this conjunctural model, can help us do the kind of work of critique that we are talking about. Because then it allows us to kind of think about the ways in which so much of our contemporary debates, the terms of our contemporary debates, have been made to look as if those are natural or inevitable, or they've always been as such. And I think looking at Asian studies, which kind of to me signals that empirical work that area studies does, allows us to reopen those terms of the contemporary debate by making things like gender or empire suddenly seem not natural the way they've evolved out of a Euro-North American history. I'll make my last point where I think Asian studies also has value in thought of in this conjunctural way rather than in a particular spatial geographical way. And I think Asian studies works beautifully for something like that precisely because there isn't that kind of political imagination pan-Asia. It really is separate places, but yet it invokes that and rewrites that earlier area study model. Here, I think it's particularly useful in thinking against the sort of civilizational, the kind of cultural, identitarian ways of thinking about Asian studies. For example, there are ways in which this Asian studies model could end up simply rewriting or simply talking about the identities of particular individuals, groups of people, regions, geographies. And it's the dissatisfaction with this model that led, say, for a scholar whose suggestions here I find very interesting, Stephen Kotkin, who rejects the term, for example, used in the US to rethink a field that earlier used to be called Soviet studies. And that field has been rethought by using the term Eurasia, which covers this region somewhere but from Japan, from Germany to Japan. And Kotkin makes you realize what the problems with a term like Eurasia could be, and that is, of course, not just its particular uncomfortable interwar history, but also its emphasis on cultural, identitarian ways of thinking. And Kotkin himself prefers another term to think about this reconstitutive field. Instead of Eurasia, he likes to think about the term ab imperio, from empire. And the reason he likes to think about ab imperio is because it brings emphasis away from identities to what he calls institutions of governance and to processes of exchange. Now, I like that. And so in a way, it could be interesting to think of what would it mean to give up Asian studies for Kotkin's From Empire. As a scholar of empire, I in some ways am attracted to that over Asian studies. But in thinking about this particular panel and the value of Asian studies, I think I would say that Asian studies still does, in this conjunctural form, something that Kotkin's ab imperio doesn't quite do. And I think what it does allow us to do is to think about institutions of governance that are not incorporated only in empires. So apart from pluralizing his ab imperio from empire to from empires, I think Asian studies allows us to talk about institutions of governance. It allows us to talk about non-imperial networks, the kind we were talking about, diasporic, pilgrim routes and networks. So, and it also allows us to talk about identity without having to fixate on identity, because a pan-Asian identity is, as yet, not a reality. So it both allows us to play with area studies and reconstitute it. So I make a speculation on the value or the continuing value of this new intellectual formation for the Asian studies.
Wonderful. We have in our agenda about 15 minutes set aside for you to talk amongst yourselves and for us, but also time for questions. And I'm assuming there are also lots of questions in the audience. I want to throw out to you what I hear in different ways, all of you talking about Tanya's regional readings, de-ghettoizing Asian studies, Naoki's Anthropos Humanitas and the performativity, question of Teoria, Lisa in multiple temporalities and spatialities, Andre in anxiety, and Minnie, which you've just so eloquently talked about. I think in some ways I want to throw out the possibility of what would vocabularies of a non-identitarian space-time look like? Because I think you're all getting at vocabularies of a non-identitarian space-time. Very abstract, very big, but that's what I would want to throw out at you. I'm not responding, but I wanted us to sort of have a discussion, or at least all of you to have a discussion. So perhaps maybe some of you would want to respond to each other before we open up to the audience, and then be quite happy to take questions from the audience to add to the conversation.
So you are asking this question
No,
is
I'm
what
throwing
is...
it out. You can
Okay.
toss it right back at me.
Yeah,
It's fine.
I'll
You don't have to
toss it
answer.
right back at you, too.
Okay.
Because from the beginning, at this end of the table, we were squirming a little bit with the type of economic language that was being used to speak and define Asian studies, and the speculation, and as playful as it was, and as perhaps as ironic as it was used to establish a certain distance. I was squirming in my seat a little bit. So the way I'd throw it back to you would be, is that the type of language that you are looking for to answer the question that you just asked? You asked us if we could throw it back to you.
Yes, you can. I think we can't get away from the reality of the fact that Asia, to cite Tanya, there's a gold rush for Asia right now. That's what's happening in the academy. It's a gold rush. It's a willy-nilly, mad gold rush. Those of us that are administrators experience this. So, inasmuch as that is economic, or perhaps it is excess, I think we need to talk about it in those terms. I think the metaphors are actually quite useful. But I'm not part of this conversation. You go ahead.
You asked for the throwback. Let me take a stab at the non-identitarian. I think the question that you posed, I think, there is something about history, and that is done with all histories are constructed to the extent that they're constructed with some kind of collective identity mirror in mind. But there are also ways in which one can do, but there's a whole history to how this becomes the dominant form of self-understanding. It is competitive societies that need well-bounded entities that project things back, right? And make them, what did you call it? Spatial spaces of identity. There are, I think, methodologies that can suggest ways in which we can have much more dispersed circulatory historical forms. We've been working with this earlier today. We had a discussion of some of these things in the early modern panel, and where you have much more of an idea of a fold or, crumpling of surfaces, where, what is celebrated as an imperialist conquest somewhere else becomes an anti-imperialist struggle, right? Or becomes celebrated. I mean, these are the kinds of connections and non-connections and dispersals that sort of bring us between divergence and convergences that could become very adequate modes of, or if not very adequate, that could become modes of inquiry. And we've got to think about ways of getting out of this. And I'm not going to deny that it's happening because the world around us is making us aware of those kinds of linkages in a way that, when you had more tunnel histories and so on, you didn't, because there's more interdependence as well as competition in the world, I think.
Minnie?
Maybe I'll try and take a stab at your question. The question you asked, that what is a non-identitarian space-time configuration? It seems to me that that question assumes that you have to have, Asian studies is a unit of analysis, that we train people in, Asian studies. But if you are persuaded in thinking of it not as a geographically bounded space, a field in which we train, but really think of it conjuncturally, that all Asian studies is a rethinking, in some ways, of the earlier area studies, which was based on identitarian politics, and it's a rethinking at a moment that's both tied to the market, where we are told that, we need to focus on Asian studies. We're told this is the rising century. So it's tied to that market, but it's also not, because we do not do, or we do not offer Asian studies as a unit of analysis.
Right.
So it's actually not a space with which to work, but it's a good or useful way to think with in some ways.
Right.
Okay, can I? It's, in a sense, I think one way to deal with identitarian politics, particularly in relation to Asia, is, more than half century ago, it was pointed out that until late 19th century, people in Asia never called themselves Asians. At a certain point, they started calling themselves Asians because they were conquered. Hence, term Asia already historically contains the structure of resentment.
Yeah.
And you cannot ignore this historical context.
Yeah.
And therefore, celebration of Asia is precisely its other side of resentment. And unless you go into the historical context within which something like epistemic category has been built, we continue to reproduce resentment. And in that sense, I think colonial history is absolutely necessary in order to understand how we become interested in the object of inquiry.
Shall we open up to questions? Questions? One? Yeah, okay.
First off, thank you very much for the very interesting presentations, and especially many thanks to Andre Schmidt for pointing out the new context in which Asian studies operates today within the logic of the neoliberal university and not our older Cold War historical conjuncture. And so I wanted to build on that point and raise the question of, neoliberal university form has produced its own set of problems in terms of the shifts in funding and financialization and closure of programs to rising student debt to the casualization of academic labor and so on and so forth. And so I'm wondering, within that, the university itself as a space has become a site of struggle. And so I'm wondering if you see any, this is the question that I guess directed more to the panel in general. You see a place for critical Asian studies as a formation in addressing these sites of struggle, not necessarily in terms of the manifest content of our research or scholarship, but as a kind of institutional formation within the university, in the act of performative politics outside of just scholarship and so on.
Great. Why don't we take if you could just two more before we have some responses. I think next.
I'm Len Sebastian from RSIS in Singapore. My question is generally to the whole panel. Andre Schmidt pointed out something very interesting about the Cold War. And I think we are in a situation now whereby we are trying to close the gate, but the horse is already bolted. And as much as we like to put the Cold War to one side, I think the US-China relationship is moving towards that direction. It may not be inevitable, but I think if you listen to voices in Southeast Asia, the deployment of American troops in Darwin has raised fears that the Cold War has resumed again in Asia, primarily because of American moves, and of course this idea of containing China. The issue we face in a place like Singapore is, how do we work towards developing Asian studies into something that we can operationalize? The context is very much also funding. Most of my colleagues, myself included, we come from universities in the West which have very strong Asian studies traditions. However, funding from the old sources, Europe, North America, is drying up. Even Japan, for that matter. But there's lots of money in Asia. But the people who want to fund have different mentalities altogether. So the issue is, and this is the question that I'd like to pose to the panel. When we think in terms of policy-relevant Asian studies, what does that conjure to?
Great. And one more. I think there was someone way in the back. Yes. Louder.
My question actually is sort of just reiterating Andre Schmidt's question, but I want to sort of put it a little more directly. So I think the question, I think a lot of the panelists were really developing some kind of a critique of modernization theory, and I think that seems to be a theme that was going through. So I guess the question then is, when is the critique of modernization theory critical? And I think if I can use the examples that I think starting with Tanya Lee, we had the idea of critical being connected to the sort of non-practical dimension, without it being actually programmatic, right? And I think, but it was interesting that as we heard one after the other talks, by the time we got to Naoki Sakai, we had the idea of theoria as being connected to a kind of detachment, a separation. So that in one of the discourses, separation implied critique, but in the other, separation was precisely the problem. And so then, if we're going to say that separation is precisely the problem, the contemplative stance, then I think just following footnote on what Naoki Sakai was saying is, well, then our task is then to historicize that separation, and then to historicize, which would then mean to historicize the critique of modernization theory, because modernization theory has been coming under critique for quite a long time. So the question then is, when do we get, what is the real object or the condition for the possibility of modernization theory that we should then really be criticizing?
Okay, let's have a round of responses to these three very rich questions.
I can try to just take a stab at some of these issues. I completely agree that there is a problem of, I think what is happening is not just happening in Asian studies or area studies. I think the problem, which is the transition from the Cold War, actually it's more than the Cold War, it's not just Cold War. Maybe area studies is Cold War. But it's really a transition from a Humboldtian model of education, which most of us had been reared upon, a humanistic model of education, to a very neoliberal one, right? And where the dominant model is the science model, which is very result-oriented. And there is no discursive space for the humanities and particularly non-instrumental social science. I think that this is, and I agree with Viren here at the back, this is actually a moment where it's not just historicization, but of engagement. And I think to the extent that we believe that we're doing something that is a more broad understanding, maybe a more holistic understanding than purely instrumental interventions, we're looking at the effects of instrumental interventions as well. We need to make our case not merely intellectually shouting and fighting within the university, but using the historical possibilities in the strategic and organizational sphere. And I think that, and this involves a great deal of thought and work. And I don't think it's very productive just to talk about all our conceptual and theoretical things aside from these, from the pressing needs, I think, of our vocations and avocations.
Anyone else?
Yeah, vocation.
Please, Nick.
Yeah, I think your point is very, very valid. And then, of course, I talked about theory in terms of dramaturgical notion of separation. And nonetheless, even at much more sort of the philosophical level, it is very difficult to dissociate the entire tradition of modern philosophy as transcendental criticism from that moment. Nonetheless, it's not simply a matter of disinterested objectivity of its inquiry. Nonetheless, there is a very severe problem about entire idea of criticism itself. Yes. And in this sense, I take your criticism, point very seriously. And I don't have any ready-made answer, of course. But nonetheless, probably my own take is that we really have to push the whole concept of critical engagement to the limit. And in this sense, it is not simply it's not possible to simply discard the European achievement in critical thinking and find somewhere mysteriously some kind of new inspiration. And I don't think it's possible. And in this sense, that's one of the reasons why I would say the West is dislocated. That is, whether you are from Asia or Africa or Latin America, you are already Westerners. That's our, I think, contemporary condition from which we have to start.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Well, I'll just make a comment on Arian's question, because I think it's an important question to try and relate the development of a critical Asian studies as an intellectual enterprise, as a political enterprise in the way that was discussed, to bring it back home to our institutions where we were actually producing that knowledge that we're claiming is critical. I don't think Asian studies has a privileged place at the university for dealing with the very important questions that you just rose, but hopefully we can struggle to make at least a parallelism or a continuation between that type of critical scholarship to dealing with those issues that are at home in our institutions.
Okay. Sorry, I saw some more hands here. Tanya, did you want to respond also?
I was going to say very briefly, don't underestimate the power of these linear modernization kinds of narratives. I mean, we may think we've done a good job of unsettling them in the academy, but we're the only people who think that, right? For everybody else, growth in GNP, urbanization, modernization, everything, good governance, whatever kind of rhetoric you find in any other sphere, including within the university, takes these linear narratives of progress and knowing the direction in which things are moving or should be moving or will eventually move is everywhere. And we have to do the kind of thing that you're describing, to recover a way of thinking which does not take linear notions of progress as the norm or as the assumed ground on which everything is, from which things can be analyzed, is a huge task. And I don't think we're even close to making headway on that. I mean, we may think we are in our scholarship, but in terms of communicating that or shifting the ground, we're nowhere at all, I think.
Okay, so
that young gentleman.
Joe, that young gentleman, and the other young gentleman. No, not you, Joe.
Joe, then.
He's the third.
Not you, Joe.
It's a question for Andre, because I share many of your anxiety. But I ask myself, what would Asian studies be in the absence of those anxieties? Right? I mean, if those anxieties were removed, what would Asian studies be?
Which is a neurotic formation.
And how do we understand?
What would you do, Andre?
What happens then?
One less beer.
I have to go to my shrink.
I mean, in a sense, the almost unthinkableness of it is actually what tells the critical.
Well, sure. Well, the maybe flippant answer is, were we supposed to do 3 questions?
Sorry.
Oh, yes, sorry.
That was
Transference. Okay, yes, okay. So I think, yes, I think I did 1 and then 2. Okay.
Hi, I'm Mark McConaughey, PhD student in the U of T's East Asian Studies Department, and this question will pick up on a lot of the same concerns that have already been addressed, but I was really struck by Professor Lisa Lowe's suggestion that the very concept of Asia is formulated in and through the logic of the market and the logic of capitalism, that whether as object of study or kind of object of desire or projection, it is fundamentally tied to capitalist modernity. And so I'm really intrigued by this conjunctural approach to Asia or to our studies in which we see things in flux. But is it not that every time we use we think of Asian studies, even in a conjunctural way, what is not in flux is the market, right? It's in flux in the sense that it's expanding, but our ability to think beyond it, that's the limit that we hit. We're constantly faced with that, especially in our institutional lives, of where we get our funding, right? It's all about a status project based on GDP growth and urbanization. And so we've had the suggestion of a kind of, from Professor Sakai, a deep epistemic critique, theoretical critique that can really help us move beyond both identitarian politics as well as, or at least to help us historicize and think through the ties to a capitalist modernity. But I'm wondering, just to, in the spirit of pushing things to the limit, if we can marry a deep epistemic critique with what Professor Tanyeli suggested as a kind of moving beyond urban modernizationist Asia, right? Seeing those other Asias that exist out there in the sphere of kind of organizational, our organizational or political lives, which is to say, can we take that epistemic critique of modernization that we think we've done really well, but we seem to have kind of failed outside the academy, and marry it somehow, whether it's in our teaching or blogging or whatever. But I'm just in the spirit of pushing this, because isn't it every time we talk of Asia, we're always tied to that limit of capitalist modernity. I'm just wondering, is it anti-capitalist or a socialist or even a social democratic politics possible within this field? Thank you.
Or possible. Period. Yeah. Yes. Yes, you. Yes.
My name is John Callahan. I'm also in the Department of East Asian Studies, and I'm always having an argument with Mark, so I always end up reiterating some of his points. But I'm going to try to frame it in a different way, because I really appreciated, Tanya, that you were talking about the provocations that a critique allows, especially in terms of in a relationship and tied to Lisa Lowe's talk about the idea of capitalist modernity. And from my understanding of capitalism, especially within the neoliberal framework, it's not so much of its hegemony as its tolerance, as what it's able to tolerate. And right, the toleration that is allowed in the institutional framework, I think, is always bought by very brutal and violent intolerances elsewhere. And so my question was, I really appreciate the necessity of the critique, but the critique is always productive. And I wanted to ask on the other side of, right, for deterritorialization, it always comes with reterritorialization. Deconstruction is always, in its own way, a form of production, and a critique is not a form of production. And I wanted to ask about, on the case of provocation, what would be an intolerable provocation? Because I always think that an intolerable provocation to this sense of capitalist modernity flashes its sort of roots. It gives us a sense of its historicity. And I wondered if people had a sense of it, if there was an example or something that we could wrap our heads around. Is it just an impossibility, or what would that intolerable provocation be to capitalism?
Okay. Andre, you were going to confess? Let's start with you.
To Joe's question, you're asking me to do what I didn't want to do tonight, which is give you a firm answer.
Proposal?
Because I don't know what that answer is, and I think the reason, or maybe even the strategy of speaking about anxieties and maybe tensions, is that struggling between those points of tensions and trying to come to terms with those anxieties is possibly itself productive, right? But I can't say where that end point is. And that's maybe bluntly why I spoke in terms of worries rather than offering a sort of statement on that value.
Oh, Lisa, go ahead.
Well, I was actually going to answer, I thought the last two questions, of course I appreciated Professor Wong's question as well, but the last two questions I thought were really wonderfully formulated and musing. And I was going to suggest that I really enjoyed Mirlanini's discussion of Asian studies being this reformulation of the critique of Asian studies, as opposed to conforming to either the Cold War or the neoliberal gaze that would situate the area, using that depth situatedness, and which is not necessarily phenomenological, but something short of this South Asia without borders, that could then return the critique of the epistemological violence. So I think, I was very enchanted by what you were framing. And also, I thought, in a way, you were also suggesting that we think about, rather than area studies, think about comparative imperial studies, as well as, of course, its critique, or its comparative insurgency or anti-imperial studies, which are, deeply implicated in it. So I thought that was a very interesting way of deconstructing Asian studies into anti-Asian studies.
Thank you. Can I add one thing to it? Thank you very much, and field very useful, because she doesn't completely break the ties of the market. So that does form a limit in rethinking what Asian studies does. But it also forms a limit in our critique of capitalist modernity and the limits of modernization theory, the question that came up earlier. So let me just give you one example how that might be formulated. So here it seems to me that one of the imperatives in our discussion right now is a critique of capitalist modernity. But if I were to now think about how Asian studies might reformulate that critique, this very situated area studies knowledge, let me draw from the field of South Asia, where a lot of intellectuals like us, and this goes back to Tanya's point earlier, that a lot of intellectuals like us are engaged in wanting to critique the neoliberal market and the corporatization of the university and capitalist modernity, but you have those rural villages, those intellectuals emerging out of that, who are also celebrating capitalist modernity, celebrating the market. Now, I'm not wanting to say, oh, that is the way to go, just because the so-called subaltern or, intellectuals are doing that, that's the way to go. But I think what it does is it fractures our conceptual categories. It fractures what it means for us to say, if you have the right politics, and all of us presumably have in the room, we will always be critical of the neoliberal market or of capitalist modernity. But that's because we are speaking from a place that is still, its conceptual categories are formed Euro-North American. But what would it mean to actually really be situated and say, it may look different. And if it looks different, I'm not saying we should agree with it, but at least it opens a space for denaturalizing what we naturalize in this room.
Are you taking? I'm going to pass this over to our David Chu chair, Professor Tak Fujitani, to close us and wrap us up. Will you please come, Tak?
Well, I'm feeling a little bit dizzy right now from all this high-level talk, and I know that everyone is anxious to continue that dizziness, but combined with some alcohol-induced, dizziness. So we'll do that. But and I know you all want me to get off this podium very quickly, but I couldn't resist a couple of comments. I've kind of, put many months now into this project, and it's so gratifying for me to see it all come together. I hate to just come up here and just say, okay, let's all drink now. So, let me just say a couple of things about this event and how important it has been. Because I arrived in Toronto, as some of you know, only less than half a year ago, and you could say that in a sense I was speculating on Toronto and what it would bring. And so it's been really a huge payoff, not so much in this instrumental sense of I made a lot of money off of it.
That too.
But in terms of what we, Ritu and Joe Wong and I and quite a number of others actually, we're really looking for some distinguished speakers, not in some kind of pro forma sense to say they publish so many books or hold such a position, but people who are distinguished in terms of really thinking the fields from this kind of alienated perspective, the kind of theoretically oriented meta level, in addition to really knowing a lot about real areas and things like uneven development, poverty, and so on. So it was really gratifying to see that all of this has come together in a kind of productive confusion. So I don't know how anyone would ever summarize this whole event, but certainly the ideal was to rethink what a critical Asian studies might be, to resist a certain kind of desire that is usually associated with speculation. And I think we really do have a lot of things that we can continue to talk about. But one of the things that I did want to mention, because for some reason or other, I don't like to be too happy or something, but this metaphor of the gold rush was kind of interesting to me, because in fact the flip side of a gold rush is a hollowing out of the university and the humanities. So it's not as if the whole university are made up of these gold mountains, like that all the Chinese are trying to access in some kind of way, but rather that certain areas of Asian studies may be prospering to some extent, but others are starving, particularly in the humanities and particularly at many public universities, where the only recourse now is to go for private funding, whereby you would answer the more straightforward kind of speculating of that. And in fact, if you want to take the metaphor of speculating even further, of course, we haven't really talked about speculating on failure, which is part of the whole financialization of the current moment, that we're speculating that people will not be able to pay their loans, speculating that some financial institutions will fail. That's the way to make money, speculating on failure. And in a way, you can see that the way that knowledge is being produced now, there is a kind of speculation based upon the failure of the humanities, and some really basic things going on with area studies training, including the training in concrete nuts and bolts Asian studies stuff like language training. So Lawrence Summers, very infamously, maybe some of you may not have heard of this, but decided that it was time to stop teaching foreign languages, because after all, everybody already speaks English. Right? So what would be the point of doing that? So in other words, the language was completely seen as being an instrument to speculating on this and that. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to think about areas that are not prospering, areas that we need to address and need to bring into the conversation about this new kind of emerging critical Asian studies. And I had some other things to say, but I'll just say one more about the whole concept of Asia that struck me as being really quite thought-provoking. All of the talk about inter-area or inter-Asia studies and transnational Asian studies and all that. But I think, in the end, as was one of the points that was made in the end, was really about how we need to continue to think about Asia as really a provisional term that we use and that we need to use, because there are real stakes involved in it. But somehow, as Dipesh Chakrabarty would say, we also need to begin this project of deprovincializing Asia, not just Europe, but Asia itself, and engage in these other conversations with other area studies. So those are just the 2 points that I wanted to sort of end with. And then finally to thank all the panelists for really a great session, and Ritu for moderating in your usual brilliant fashion, and for all of the people attending from scholars in Asian studies across the world, really graduate students, and also some of my undergraduate students there. So I really want to thank everybody, and with that I'd like to close and say let's enjoy talking more with each other and relax. I forgot something very, very extremely important. Although many of our names were already mentioned up here, there are 2 very important people who did really so much of the work and had so much of the imagination to put this roundtable together, and that is 2 people on our staff, Eileen Lam and Aga Baranaska. Okay, with that, let's go. Thank you.
Struggle, reducing a different way of thinking about rights and sovereignty.